Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I am Catherine Cassidy, CEO and founder of Boutique Box. If you don't know me, Boutique Box is for professional women to deliver to their door style curated to their life, their style, and their career. After over 10 years of working with professional women as personal stylists, and prior to that, being in the corporate fashion industry, I really just saw that there was a disconnect between what women wanted and needed and what was being put out there. And I believed that it should be easy for women to get out the door feeling like their best selves. What I realized in working with professional women over the years is it wasn't that they needed the guidance to define their style. It was just about finding the right pieces. So that's what we're building with Boutique Box. And while we're in the business of helping you find the pieces that are perfect for you, the heart of the business is really in how you feel and empowering you to take on each day feeling confident, courageous, at ease, grounded, and just like yourself. So Mary Stephenson, I'm so excited to have joining us for these conversations. And I should also say I have been in DC for a while, and these salons happened really organically where I would invite women to come together and just have conversation. It started around style, and it really opened my eyes to seeing all of the things that women were working through, especially in DC where it's like the heart of women's leadership. And, you know, these beautiful organic conversations where there was this connection and this community that was naturally developed. And since we're not going to be doing those events in person, I wanted to bring them online. And with these, we'll be doing something every weekend. But with these, the intention is really just to create a space to, again, have these conversations of what are we going through? How can we support each other? What kind of magic connections can happen? And with Boutique Box, building the community is a really important part of what we will be doing over the long term. Because if this time isn't showing us now, it's clear that we are all in this together. And so I'm so happy to have Mary here with you. She is one of my advisors for Boutique Box as an executive strategist and catalyst for change, also a fellow USC alumna. So with that, I will share Mary and her brilliance with you. I mean, I'm not like sharing her, but really I wanted everyone to get to experience her brilliance, and let you take it away, Mary. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So hello, everybody. Welcome to another Zoom call. I hope this one might feel a little more expansive for everybody, because I know we've been spending an awful lot of time on screen. I'm so happy to be here. I want to just share a little bit about what I do in the real world and the virtual world now, and also how I met Catherine, because I don't think anything's by accident. And a lot of the work I do is to help leaders, men and women, come into their authenticity and really understand and expand into probably the kind of leader that they didn't think they could be. And especially as we move into these very strange and unknown times, I think the work that I'm going to present today hopefully will be applicable in your lives. But first, I'd like to say that Catherine is a divergent leader, and that's what we're going to talk about today. When I first met her, which was on the USC campus, we were both actually teaching a class at a women's conference. And it was like one of those moments where you meet somebody and you're like, wow, you're authentic, you have depth, you're intelligent, and you're kind of brilliant because you're a divergent. You see something other people don't see. And I know you're trying to blend in, but you don't need to, because you're really unique and the world needs you. And so that really sprung our relationship, so that I've been helping Catherine think through how to build this business to bring intelligent style to female leaders. And there's never been a more important moment to be a female leader, I think, than this very moment in history, and to be a male leader. But we need the feminine right now, because the world is, as we know, it's a little bit lost, and we're in a moment of crisis. And the feminine qualities, and what I mean by the feminine is like the range of qualities that a woman can embody, and also the awareness that a woman who isn't afraid of her darkness and isn't afraid of the light is able to bring to situations. So in the world, what I do every day is I work with both men and women, but particularly I work with an organization called Chief, and a few of you on the call are participating in that. And it's an amazing foresight into what the world really needed. So they developed a program for female leaders in the C-suite and, in and around the top leadership positions in corporations, to help support the women in stepping into their power so they can step into leadership in the world in a way that we've not seen. And that was just started a year ago. And to date, I think we have 2,500 women who are in the program in New York City, and we are launching many more programs in different cities across at least the United States at this point. So that's what I do and every day. And I've been, for the past couple of years, engaging with all of my private clients, men and women, talking about the fact that the world was just about to change in a very significant way, and that we needed to prepare for that. Now, I didn't exactly know that I was preparing people for a pandemic. That was definitely a surprise for me. But when it came last month, I would say I got more calls from people who've been working with me saying, thank you for getting us ready. Thank you for being able to talk about what leadership really needs to look like going forward. So what Catherine asked me to do today was just highlight some ideas around a concept that I came up with last month, which is called Divergent Leadership. And maybe if anybody can raise your hand if you have seen the movie or have, well, I can't see you now, but many of you may have seen the movie, which is called Divergent. It came out in 2014, but it's actually created by a book that came out a few years earlier. And I highly recommend it. It's a very entertaining series. But what's fascinating is the way that they speak through, we're just get that set up perfect. So the way that they talk about the different types of individuals who are needed in a society. And so it's basically a sci-fi thriller movie and concept. But in the movie and in the book, and we can advance the slide, Catherine, in the movie and in the book, it talks about this idea of being a divergent. And I really liked that, especially in this time of chaos, to put a structure, to put some architecture around how men and women right now can think about what the world needs and how to show up at work, at home, for their communities. So the idea around a divergent from a biological perspective is, as this says, an evolution of different form or structure that adapts to different environments. So very adaptive. Another example is just somebody who is different from a common point. So something is diverting from a current path, it's moving in a different direction. My favorite, I think, is the mathematical reference point, which is that to be a divergent means that you could be infinite, that there's a sequencing that's always expanding, that there has no limits. And we can move to the next slide. I really love that idea because I do think that humanity is moving in an evolutionary moment right now. And so leaders who are going to be the most helpful are going to be leaders who have already done some of their own inner development. So I'm going to define this for you and break it down a little bit. And you can see from the imaging there that a divergent leader is somebody who holds peace, they're intelligent, they have honesty, they're selfless, and I think the most important piece right now is that they're brave. And in our world right now, I think we're seeing examples of divergent leadership. And these are people who have extraordinary capability to help change and move humans through change, but for the greatest good. The second point I think is also important is that they can do this in this, no matter if they're facing an opposition. In other words, there might be an old way of doing things, and in fear or with fear and ambiguity, people can sometimes revert to very challenging behavior. But a divergent leader is able to work in that environment. It's like a little bit of a toxic environment, but they, to the third point, they can quickly co-create a contingency plan. They're confident. You know, we're seeing this too in the world. I mean, I know everybody's seeing examples of this with people online. You know, I talk about Brene Brown a lot, and she's created a new podcast, which I would highly recommend. But people are, you know, they're stepping up and they're leading themselves confidently, and they're leading us through these times, even though it feels like the unknown. And then the final point, and I would say this was a place where Catherine and I have been very like-minded, is that many people who I would consider to be divergent leaders, they've spent a lot of time in their lives feeling different. And not better, but just feeling like they might not belong, or maybe they see things that other people don't see. And I think what's happening in this moment that we're in is we're having a changing of the guards. So the leaders who have been leading our world and our corporations since time immemorial, honestly, since history has been written, basically, we're going to see a new, like a whole new spectrum of leadership show up. And, you know, we have to believe that, right? As a humanity, we have to believe that that's possible. Next slide. So let's talk about that old framework of leadership. And I'm going to go to the most polarity here. You know, everything's a paradox, but as a polarity to divergent leadership, we could say toxic leadership. And many of you may have worked in some environments like this. And what is it that toxic leadership is? Well, it's first of all been sort of the backbone of organizations and societies. I called it command and control, but it's authoritative. You know, it's very paternal. But sort of the worst parts of that leaders may carry, they may be like bad people, right? But they also just may be not very evolved people. So the third bullet I think is really interesting here, because it says it's quite difficult to craft a differentiation between destructive leaders that are genuinely toxic, or bad leaders that are not toxic, but maybe just incompetent, and then leaders with mental disorders, and sometimes really good leaders who lead people down the wrong path. So the way I'm describing toxic leadership over in the image is, you know, a little bit of abuse of supervision. You might know the term gaslighting, where they make you feel crazy and they're manipulating. You know, self-centered, just leaders who are not thinking about other people, they're thinking about themselves and showing up maybe in a very sort of narcissistic way. And then, you know, dishonesty and managing people, their favorites, and then not necessarily treating people the same. Okay, we'll go to the next one. And we won't spend much time anymore on the toxic side, but I did want to at least give you the frame of where divergent leadership is going to show up now and lead us into the future in a much better way. So these are the sort of the cornerstones of how you develop your own leadership style in this way. And the first thing is that a divergent leader is someone who is able to perceive at a very high level. And what I mean by that is they have an ability to use not just their linear logical mind, but they also can use their intuitive, their gut instincts, their awareness of what right and wrong really is, with, again, this idea of taking people in the right direction towards the greatest good. And in the Divergent movie, they talk about 5 different factions of society, where some people are there to keep the peace, some people are just there to be selfless, some people to be brave, some people just using their intellect, and others honesty. And what I'm experiencing here and bringing into the world and like having you think about is, well, what if you could be all of those things? So divergent leadership is all of those things. And we'll go to the next slide. So instead of utilizing, like in the toxic leadership, just one approach, they actually can rely on multidimensional capabilities. And this is somebody who's done a lot of inner work. They know how to find peace in the moment of stress. They can use their intelligence and selflessness and honesty to make decisions. And I think the second bullet is also really, really important, is that they really understand how to manage fear, and they understand the nature of fear. And this might be a really interesting point for the moment that we're all living in right now, because the best leadership is going to be able to see the fear and understand the anxiety of their people or their families or themselves, but not let it just completely shut them down. And that's where humanity is at this turning point. We have arrived at a place where we have more people who are leaning into their divergent natures that can lead us into the future and knowing how to manage through the fear and anxiety, because fear doesn't shut them down. It actually wakes them up to the greatest possibility of what's next. And then the third thing, and you don't have to go back, I can just say that, but is that mindfulness and using meditation and understanding how to be working with your own nervous system is really important for anybody who's developing their divergent qualities, because the body itself actually is the anchor point for bringing in awareness and managing your own anxiety and fear. So and I may actually lead us in a quick exercise at the end of this to illustrate that point. So the next slide.
Oh, this is the next slide.
Oh.
Do you want me to go?
The next one. Even the next one.
Okay. I was trying to anticipate you.
Awesome. Okay, so oh, wait. Yeah, that's right.
There we go.
Go back. There, perfect. This one. Okay, so just to break it down even further, and I'm pointing to these words are all pointing to somebody who would be very empathetic. But I love Brené Brown's work. It's so timely. I would encourage anybody who's feeling a lot of anxiety right now, or a concern about how they're showing up at work, managing, I know women are, especially, and men too, but certainly women are trying to homeschool their children and, have their job and worrying about their job. And so it's a lot of stress. And I think her work, and she has so much of it out there, really helps land people in what's important. I love her book, Dare to Lead. I highly recommend it. And the way she speaks about leaders living into their values. And I think in this moment that they're not silent about the hard things. And that's difficult, right? And especially when you have to make hard decisions for people and their livelihoods right now. It's a very difficult time. And then divergent leaders know how to cultivate and live in integrity. And again, they're able to work with fear. So how do I work with the fear? And then how do I still encourage creativity and inspiration? Because if I can bring in creativity and inspiration into myself, literally into my body, right? And into my home and into my Zoom sessions, then fear doesn't gather, because it can't. If I've got love and creativity and inspiration in one space, the fear actually can't coincide with that. And then this final point is, I love it, because right now we need to envision the future together and then take the right actions and help people go in a different direction. So by using our creativity together and our inspiration, we're going to build a new world that's a little bit different or a lot different from what we've had before. And even though we can't see it, divergent leadership is always like, it's pointing to something that we're going to do together and allowing you to experience it before it occurs. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So collaborators, we know, at this moment, there are a lot of people who are scrambling to figure out how to collaborate with people through the ethers. How do you harness the power of teams and groups, and do that in a way that is encouraging instead of shutting people down? And it's very hard to do. I think it's very hard in the old energy to lead people online and from the home. I think it's interesting, right? Like, it's this construct of home working from home and being online. It's requiring something very different to keep people's attention and to bring people together. So, and then divergent leaders, once you've crossed the threshold of authenticity, living where people are lying or trying to deceive or do the wrong thing, it's very difficult. It doesn't work. It's like, again, you can't live in that space at the same time you're living in a place of possibility. So tough love and heartfelt compassion, so they can hold like the truth of what's happening in a situation and lead depending on the circumstances. And then they can work with the psychological needs of others. So they tune in, they've got empathy and they can feel what's happening. And then from that feeling, help people to move to a different place so that a different outcome, a better outcome is possible. Perfect. All right. And these are just sort of last couple points. And as you can see, we could have a conversation and come up with many more qualities of a divergent leader, but I think there's 12 in total, and I think they're the ones that resonate as sort of top line, that if we were to take this in and start working with them for ourselves, we would start to see, a lot of change in the world. And in doing that and experimenting, the thing about divergent leaders is they're going to take a risk. Like we'll say Catherine, right? She's got a great idea and when she first had the idea, it was ahead of its time. It's almost like she was engaging with something that was going to be needed in the future and holding the vision for that and not apologizing for it. And knowing that like it was going to show up and trying things. And divergent leadership is about trying new things and putting yourself out there and not trying to be perfect, because we're not. And this is definitely something we're seeing when we're working on the Zoom all day. And, people have their families around and we hear these kind of funny stories about like people, of course they're not perfect. You're in their home every day with them. So we're learning, we're like creating this whole new construct of how we come together in our realness. We're real human beings and we're not perfect. And finally, divergent leaders, they're going to take the curveball. We don't know what's going to happen this week. We hear things in the news. I'm in New York City, for example, and there's a lot of challenge here. And we don't know what this curveball is going to be, but I do know that in the work that I do with leaders is that we're always looking for the value in what's happening in the moment and using what's happening. Kind of like, if you walk into your pantry and you're like, what are we going to cook today? And you may be doing this at home, like what's left, or, what should I do to use what I have at my disposal? And that is really divergent leadership. We're going to have to work with what's here and help people find value and make the right changes towards something that's going to be better for everybody. Next slide. So these are just some ideas around who I think my thought leaders are. There's many, many more, but just to share, Brene Brown I've mentioned, and that is a link to her podcast as well. Simon Sinek, I think he is so inspiring. He's got a huge following. He wrote Finding Your Why, but he's very much online. He's very active right now as a divergent leader himself and helping people stay focused on what's important and who they are and finding their own authenticity. Christopher Witecki, he is a psychic spiritual astrologer, and I'm a student of astrology. I follow, it's another framework and that I think is interesting to follow, just like personality types or types of organizations, and looking at the energies that are here with us right now, present. And there's a lot there. There's a lot of historical references as well. And it just informs me, which helps me inform my clients, which is, by the way, how I sort of was predictive in this moment and talking to people as long as 3 years ago, talking about this moment and how to prepare for it. And then finally, just the toxic leadership conversation, not that we want to over pivot on that, but I did find that this book, The Most Toxic Leadership, the Most Menacing Form of Leadership, was helpful in just looking at the dichotomies of where leadership has gone wrong and now focusing on divergent leadership and what's possible. And then I want to, as we move to the last slide, I want to say something about in the new world, as I call it, the thing that divergent leaders are going to do the very best is they're going to be able to create experiences for people. And I'm going to do that just simply right now as Catherine brings us back together. I'm just going to play a song and we're going to have an experience together, because I think divergent leadership is fundamentally based on bringing love into the world. Thank you, everybody, for being such a attentive audience to my PowerPoint. I'm usually not a PowerPoint person, but I thought it was important to consolidate all the concepts that divergent leadership includes. So,
well, I think it's helpful because some people are auditory, some people are visual, so it gives the way to retain whichever is better for you. Some people are both. I have a question for you before we dig into, open up and bring in more conversation and parts of it. Something that's always been something that I've thought about, just witnessing people in my life or considering for myself or whatever, like leadership as a role versus leadership as action, or leadership of yourself, or, like this idea of like what constitutes a leader.
mm-hmm.
Because I think it's really easy to say, oh, you're the leader because you're, in that role. Yeah. But, like one of my core values is leading by example and integrity. And so if I see someone in that role not operating that, or there's like a peer that, so anyways, that's that idea of what is leadership.
Yeah, it's a great one. I mean, I think that sometimes leadership is given to a person, somebody in the old days, or somebody passes away and you become the king or the queen, and sometimes that happens too in our government or in corporations, and people aren't quite ready for the role that they're given. But I also think that in the new world, I think that people will start to understand leadership as a way of being the best authentic version of yourself. And that's where this idea of self-leadership, it's a term, right? It's an overused term in a sense, but it's to be an authentic participant of the collective of humanity. And the people that are going to take us forward are going to understand, they're going to have a calling. And I do believe that the people, for example, that I work with that resonate, they will resonate with my, you could say, my energy, the vibration that I bring. And I don't worry about who comes to me or who doesn't, but they tend to be people who are very sensitive in nature and that they've felt a calling and they want to step up and step out. And because they actually embody the qualities that we've been speaking about as a divergent leader. But we need to understand something about this moment is that the old guard of leadership, they won't be the ones leading us into the future, say 2, 5, 10 years from now. The needs of leadership are going to look very different, but they also don't want to give up their power. So one of the things that we're speaking about right now, it actually does have to do with power. Mm-hmm. So I'll just bring that in because sometimes people don't like that word, but there's positive power and then there's different kind of experience of power. I'm curious what people, like how that lands for people to think about power and leadership and female leadership.
That actually, I was listening to, speaking of Brene Brown, her first episode where she talks about FFTs. And you can use whatever words you want for the first one. It doesn't need to be an expletive, but first time. And it sometimes is not the best experience the first time around. But she shared Martin Luther King quote around power, whereas it comes from purpose and passion. Mm-hmm. I'm totally not like what the actual quote is, people. But I thought it was really interesting because it's like renaming it or reframing mm-hmm. it in a way, like that's such a feminine way of looking at power, because, and this is where my work with women in leadership has been all of these years, is like women. And what I loved when I moved from LA to DC is women are purpose driven. If women are typically, especially if they're in their feminine leadership style, going for a leadership role to be a leader, it is not by ego. In fact, like what you're talking about, it's, I need to get out of my own way because I know I need to do this. And the purpose mm-hmm. and the passion is moving them forward. And like, they can just pretend, like they ignore all the other stuff. I mean, I think Brene Brown actually is a really good example of this as well, as she talks about like, I'm not interested in any of this. Why am I the person that's bringing this to the table? Like, I'd so much rather not be.
Right. I love this. This is a very important point. And this is what I was kind of like pointing at. I always used a lot of props, so I use my hands, is that, and I want to say, let me pause. I am not anti-men at all. Like, I love men. And I think that the challenge for men and women right now is understanding that there's just been a dysfunction and an imbalance in everybody. I mean, everybody, with gender, with race, with everything. There's just been this mishmash of things just not working and not supportive. So I also want to distinguish that feminine leadership qualities are also something that men need to hold, because to be a whole human being is where we hold both.
Absolutely.
So for example, in this presentation, I'm not afraid to use my masculine and to be here, and you're not, Catherine. We're stepping in, and this is you could say that's a little bit masculine, but I'm also really wanting to bring in the care and the empathy and the feminine and playing my song about love, because that's also what I know is needed.
Absolutely.
And a word that I would also say that is very helpful for us is sovereign leadership. Sovereignty.
Yeah. Well, and to the point of not being anti-men, even as you were going through the characteristics, I was like, tough love, but also compassion really actually made me think of my grandfather. So, 100% that there can be that, like, it's not about a man versus a woman. It's a style. It's whole. And I think with that, it's a good opportunity to kind of shift into the open conversation, because I think we've given some little nuggets to think on. And Mary, you and I, we were sharing before, I think we could lead into this question of, how are you experiencing this? Like, what is some of the takeaways, and feel free to just chime in. I'm about to pause the recording, but chime in to share, how are you experiencing this as a leader, and what resonates about this idea of divergent leadership. So thank you so much, Mary.
You're welcome. Such a pleasure.